I've always been pretty careful about meeting strangers from the internet, but sometimes a deal is just too good to pass up. I was looking for a decent gaming setup since my old computer finally gave up on me after 5 years of heavy use. New gaming rigs cost way too much, so I figured Craigslist would be my best bet to find something used but still decent. After browsing for about a week, I came across this listing that immediately caught my attention. It was a complete gaming setup, high-end PC, dual monitors, mechanical keyboard, the works, all for about half of what it would cost new. The pictures looked legit too, showing everything set up in what appeared to be a clean bedroom. The poster went by the name Jake and had written a pretty detailed description about how he was moving across the country for work and needed to sell everything quickly. I sent him a message that same day explaining that I was really interested and could meet whenever worked for him. Jake got back to me within an hour, which was faster than most Craigslist sellers usually respond. He seemed friendly enough and said he could meet that evening around 8 p.m. since he worked during the day. The timing was a bit later than I usually preferred for these kinds of meetups, but the deal was too good to let slip away. He gave me an address that was about 25 minutes from my place, in a part of town I wasn't too familiar with. When I looked it up on Google Maps, it appeared to be in a regular residential area with decent-looking houses, so I didn't think much of it. I told my roommate where I was going and what time I'd be back, which is something I always do when meeting people from online. That evening, I drove over to the address Jake had given me. The house was on a quiet street with not many streetlights, which made it feel a bit isolated. It was a 2-story house that looked pretty normal from the outside, maybe a little run down, but nothing too concerning. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door. Before I could even knock, the door opened and this guy, who I assumed was Jake, greeted me with a big smile. "Hey, you must be here for the gaming setup," he said enthusiastically. He was probably in his early 30s, average height, and seemed friendly enough at first glance. I nodded and told him yes, that I was excited to see what he had. He invited me inside and started walking toward the back of the house, mentioning that everything was set up in his home office. As we walked through the house, I started to notice some things that didn't quite add up. The living room we passed through was completely empty except for a single folding chair in the corner. There were no decorations on the walls, no TV, nothing that suggested someone actually lived there. When I asked about it, Jake quickly explained that he had already packed most of his stuff for the move and had been selling furniture throughout the week. We got to what he said was his office, and sure enough, there was the gaming setup from the pictures. Everything looked exactly as advertised. The computer was running, both monitors were on, and all the peripherals were there. I have to admit, seeing it all set up like that made me lower my guard a bit because it seemed legitimate. Jake started showing me different features of the computer, talking about the specs and how well it ran various games. He seemed to know what he was talking about, which made me feel more comfortable. I spent about 10 minutes checking everything out, and it all appeared to be in great condition. When I asked if I could test a few things to make sure they worked properly, he said of course and stepped back to give me some room. That's when I started to feel like something was off. While I was focused on the computer, I noticed in my peripheral vision that Jake had moved to stand between me and the doorway. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but when I shifted to get a better angle to see the monitors, he moved again, maintaining his position, blocking the exit. I tried to stay calm and asked him about the price, hoping to wrap things up quickly. He quoted me the same price from the listing, but then said he preferred to be paid in cash only, which wasn't unusual for Craigslist deals. However, when I pulled out my wallet to count the money, I noticed him watching my hands very intently. almost like he was studying my movements. The situation got even weirder when I asked about loading everything into my car. Jake said we could worry about that in a few minutes, but first he wanted to show me some other things he was selling that weren't in the original listing. He mentioned that he had some other electronics in the basement that I might be interested in, since I seemed to know about computers. That's when every alarm bell in my head started going off. I've seen enough true crime shows to know that basements and isolated situations don't mix well. I politely declined, saying that I was only interested in the gaming setup and needed to get going soon. Jake's demeanor changed noticeably after I refused to go to the basement. The friendly smile disappeared, and he got this look in his eyes that made me really uncomfortable. He insisted that I should at least take a quick look since I was already there, and he started moving closer to me while talking. I decided right then that I needed to get out of there immediately. I told him that I had changed my mind about the purchase and started walking toward the doorway. Jake quickly stepped directly in front of me and asked why I was leaving so suddenly, saying that we hadn't finished our business yet. My heart was pounding at this point, but I tried to stay calm and told him that I realized I didn't have enough cash with me and would need to come back another time. He stared at me for what felt like forever, then said that wasn't a problem because he had a card reader and could take other forms of payment. I knew I had to get out of there right away. I told him I really needed to leave and tried to push past him toward the door. That's when he grabbed my arm and said I shouldn't be in such a hurry. The way he said it was really threatening, and I could feel his grip tightening. Without thinking, I yanked my arm away and shoved him as hard as I could, then ran toward the front door. I heard him yelling behind me, but I didn't stop to see what he was doing. I made it to my car and locked the doors immediately, then sped out of there as fast as I could. Once I got a few blocks away, I pulled over and called the police to report what had happened. I gave them the address and described Jake as best I could. The officers told me they would check it out, and they called me back about an hour later with some disturbing news. Turns out the house had been vacant for several months, and the owners had no idea anyone was using it. Even worse, the police found evidence that someone had been living there temporarily, including sleeping bags and food supplies. The gaming setup was still there, but when they ran the serial numbers, it turned out the equipment had been reported stolen from a local electronics store just 2 weeks earlier. The scariest part is that they found zip ties, duct tape, and some other things in the basement that suggested Jake had much worse plans for whoever showed up to buy his gaming setup. The police think he was using stolen merchandise to lure people to the empty house, and I was probably just lucky that I trusted my instincts and got out when I did. They never caught Jake, and I still get nervous every time I see a deal on Craigslist that seems too good to be true. I always meet sellers in public places now, no matter how legitimate they seem or how good the deal is. Sometimes saving money just isn't worth the risk. After finishing my photography degree, I was pretty much broke and desperate for any kind of work to pay the bills. My student loans were piling up, and my part-time job at the campus bookstore wasn't cutting it anymore. I had been applying to regular photography studios for months with no luck, so I figured I'd try looking for freelance gigs on Craigslist. I knew it was a bit risky, but I didn't really have many other options at the time. Most of the photography listings on there were either obvious scams or way too sketchy for me to consider, but after browsing for about a week, I found one that seemed legitimate. The posting was from someone named David, who said he needed a photographer for a small family gathering at his house. He mentioned it would be about 3 hours of work and was offering pretty decent pay for what sounded like an easy job. The description seemed normal enough, just taking pictures of his family during a dinner party to celebrate his daughter's graduation. I sent him an email with some of my portfolio samples and explained that I was a recent graduate looking to build my client base. David got back to me the next day, saying he was impressed with my work and wanted to hire me for the following Saturday evening. The timing worked perfectly for me since I didn't have anything else going on that weekend. We exchanged a few more emails over the next couple of days, working out the details. He said the event would start around 6 p.m. and probably go until about 9 p.m. He also mentioned that it would be mostly candid shots of the family interacting, nothing too formal or complicated. Everything about the conversation seemed professional and straightforward, which made me feel confident about taking the job. On Saturday afternoon, David sent me his address along with some specific directions, since he said his house was a bit hard to find. It was about 30 minutes outside of town in what he described as a quiet, rural area. I had never been to that part of the county before, but the directions seemed clear enough. I loaded up my camera equipment and headed out around 5:30 to make sure I'd arrive on time. The drive took me through some pretty isolated countryside with not many houses around. As I got closer to the address, the roads got narrower and there were fewer street signs. I had to use my GPS to make sure I was going the right way, which was already making me a bit nervous. When I finally found the house, it was at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by trees. From what I could see, it was a decent-sized house, but looked pretty old and worn down. There were no other cars in the driveway, which struck me as odd, since David had mentioned it was supposed to be a family gathering. I figured maybe the other family members hadn't arrived yet or had parked somewhere else. I grabbed my equipment bag and walked up to the front door. Before I could knock, David opened it and greeted me with a big smile. He was probably in his late 40s, average build, and seemed friendly enough at first. He thanked me for coming and invited me inside, saying that everyone was excited to have a professional photographer there. As soon as I stepped into the house, though, I immediately noticed that something felt off. The place was completely silent. No voices, no music, nothing that you'd expect from a family gathering. When I asked David where everyone was, he quickly explained that they were all in the backyard getting things set up, and we'd join them in a few minutes. He led me into what appeared to be the living room and asked me to set my equipment down while he went to let the family know I had arrived. The room was pretty sparse, just a few pieces of old furniture and some random decorations on the walls. What really bothered me was that there were no family photos anywhere, which seemed strange for someone who was hiring a photographer for a family event. David disappeared into the back of the house, and I started unpacking my camera to get ready. That's when I noticed that I couldn't hear any voices or activity coming from outside, even though he said the family was in the backyard. I walked over to the window that faced the back of the house and looked out, but I couldn't see anyone or any signs of a party setup. I was starting to get a really uncomfortable feeling about the whole situation. I decided to call out to David to ask him a question, just to see if he would respond. When I got no answer, I walked toward the back of the house to find him. The hallway was pretty dark, and most of the doors were closed. I called his name again, but still got no response. That's when I heard a door close somewhere upstairs, followed by footsteps. I figured David must have gone upstairs for something, so I called up to him, asking if everything was okay. Instead of David's voice, though, I heard what sounded like multiple people whispering, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart started racing at this point because I realized that David had lied to me about the family being in the backyard. There were clearly other people in the house, but why would he not want me to know about them? Everything about the situation was starting to feel really wrong. I quickly walked back to the living room to pack up my equipment and get out of there. As I was putting my camera back in its case, I heard the whispering getting closer, like people were coming down the stairs. I tried to move faster, but my hands were shaking and I was having trouble with the zippers on my bag. Just as I was about to head for the front door, David appeared in the doorway with a completely different expression on his face. The friendly smile was gone, and he had this weird look in his eyes that made me really scared. He asked me where I was going, saying that we hadn't even started the photo session yet. I told him that I wasn't comfortable with the situation and needed to leave, but he stepped closer to me and said that wouldn't be possible since everyone was expecting to get their pictures taken. The way he said it was really threatening, and I could tell that he wasn't going to just let me walk out. I heard more footsteps coming from different parts of the house, and I realized that there were probably several other people there who I hadn't seen yet. I knew I had to get out immediately, so I grabbed my equipment bag and tried to push past David toward the front door. He reached out to grab my arm, but I managed to pull away from him and run toward the exit. I could hear him yelling behind me, along with other voices that I didn't recognize. I made it to my car and threw my bag in the back seat, then sped down the gravel driveway as fast as I could. As I was driving away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw David and two other men standing in the front yard watching me leave. The whole thing was absolutely terrifying, and I have no idea what they were planning to do. When I got home, I immediately called the police to report what had happened. I gave them the address and described David as best I could. The officer I spoke with said they would send someone to check it out, and they called me back a few hours later with some disturbing information. It turns out that the house had been abandoned for over 2 years, and the real owner had no idea that anyone was using it. Even more concerning, the police found evidence that multiple people had been staying there recently, including sleeping arrangements for several individuals. They also discovered some photography equipment that had been reported stolen from a local camera shop. The scariest part was when the officer told me that they found zip ties and rope in one of the upstairs bedrooms, along with what appeared to be a makeshift photography setup. It seemed like David and whoever he was working with were using fake photography jobs to lure people to the abandoned house for who knows what purpose. They never caught David or the other people involved, and the whole experience made me completely rethink how I approach freelance work. I only take jobs now through established agencies or with clients who can provide references. Sometimes a good-paying job just isn't worth the risk, especially when it involves meeting strangers in isolated locations. After my sophomore year of college, I decided to move off campus with my best friend, who I'll call Alex. We found this decent 2-bedroom apartment that was pretty affordable if we split the rent, but after a few months, we realized we had definitely overestimated how much money we'd be making with our part-time jobs. The rent was eating up most of our paychecks, and we were both struggling to pay for food and other expenses on top of everything else. We talked about it for a while and decided that the best solution would be to find a third roommate to help with costs. The apartment had a pretty big living room that we could easily convert into a bedroom if we needed to. We started by asking around our friend group, but nobody was really looking for a place at the time, so we figured we'd have to look online. I made a posting on Facebook, and Alex put one up on Craigslist describing the room and what we were looking for in a roommate. We got a few responses over the next couple weeks, but most of them were either people who couldn't afford the rent split or just seemed kind of sketchy from their messages. Then Alex got an email from this guy named Marcus, who seemed really interested and professional. He said he was a recent graduate who had just landed a job in town and needed a place to stay while he got settled. His email was well written, and he asked good questions about the lease and utilities, so we both felt pretty good about him. We set up a time for him to come look at the apartment, and when he showed up, he seemed like a normal guy. He was probably in his mid-20s, well-dressed, and seemed pretty clean and organized. He looked around the place, asked about parking and laundry, and said he was definitely interested in moving in. We talked about the rent split and house rules, and everything seemed to go smoothly. Marcus moved in the following weekend, and at first everything was great. He was quiet, kept his area clean, and would hang out with us sometimes to watch TV or just chat about work and school. He told us he worked for some tech company downtown and seemed to have his life pretty well together compared to us college kids. But after about a month, Marcus started acting really different. He stopped hanging out with us completely and would barely even say hello when we saw him in the apartment. He'd come home from work and go straight to his room, then leave again early in the morning before either of us were awake. Alex and I figured maybe he was just busy with his new job, or maybe he was just more of a private person than we initially thought. It was about 2 months into him living there when things started getting really weird. I came home from class one afternoon, and Alex pulled me aside, looking pretty concerned. He told me that he had heard Marcus on the phone earlier talking to someone in what sounded like a really heated argument. Alex said he couldn't make out most of what was being said, but he heard Marcus yelling something about, "They'll never find me here, and I'm not going back." That definitely seemed strange to me, but we didn't really know what to make of it. People have arguments with family or friends all the time, so we decided not to worry about it too much. But then a few days later, I noticed that Marcus had started getting mail addressed to different names. I saw envelopes for a David Richardson and a Michael Torres that were clearly meant for our apartment. When I mentioned it to Alex, he said he had noticed the same thing and had been wondering about it. We thought maybe it was mail from previous tenants that was still being delivered to our address, but the timing seemed too coincidental with Marcus moving in. About a week after that, I was coming home late from work, and I saw Marcus in the parking lot talking to someone in a car with tinted windows. They seemed to be having an intense conversation, and when Marcus saw me walking up, he quickly ended the conversation, and the car drove off really fast. When I asked him about it, he just said it was a co-worker and went inside without saying anything else. Alex and I started paying more attention to Marcus's behavior after that, and we noticed a bunch of other weird things. He would get phone calls at all hours of the night, and we could hear him talking in hushed tones through the walls. He also started receiving packages that he would immediately take to his room without leaving them in the common area like normal people do. The breaking point came about 3 months into him living with us. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear Marcus moving around, which wasn't unusual since he sometimes worked late. But then I heard the front door open and close, and when I looked out my window, I saw him loading stuff into his car. It was like 3 a.m., so I figured maybe he had some kind of emergency. The next morning, Marcus was gone. Not just out for the day, but completely gone. His room was mostly empty, except for some random furniture and clothes that looked like they'd been left behind in a hurry. Alex and I were both pretty confused and tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail every time. We waited a few days thinking maybe he'd come back, or at least contact us about his stuff, but nothing. After about a week, we decided we should probably call the police just to make sure nothing bad had happened to him. We were also worried about being stuck with his portion of the rent if he had just bailed on us. The officer who came to take the report asked us a bunch of questions about Marcus and wanted to see his room and any identification we might have for him. We showed him the lease agreement that Marcus had signed and gave him the phone number we had been using to contact him. A few days later, the same officer called us back with some pretty shocking news. He said that the name Marcus had given us didn't match any records they could find, and the phone number was registered to a prepaid account that couldn't be traced. Even more disturbing, the credit check information he had provided when we ran his application came back as belonging to someone who had died 2 years earlier. The officer told us that based on the different names on the mail and the fake identity, it seemed like Marcus was probably involved in some kind of fraud or was running from something. They started treating it as a possible case of identity theft rather than a missing person situation. We ended up having to change the locks on the apartment because we had no idea if Marcus had made copies of the keys or if he might come back. The police took some of the stuff he had left behind as evidence, but they told us not to expect any updates unless something major developed in the case. About a month later, a detective called us to let us know that they had connected the fake identity Marcus was using to several other fraud cases in different states. Apparently, he had a history of renting places under false names and then disappearing, sometimes leaving behind debts or other problems for the landlords and roommates. The scariest part was when the detective told us that in one of the other cases, the fake roommate had been suspected of stealing personal information from the people he lived with to use for identity theft. That made us realize that Marcus had probably had access to our mail, our personal documents, and who knows what else while he was living there. We never heard anything else about the case, and as far as I know, they never caught him. Alex and I ended up having to monitor our credit reports for months afterward to make sure he hadn't stolen our identities too. The whole experience definitely made us a lot more careful about who we trust and let into our lives. It's still weird to think that we were living with someone for months who was basically a complete mystery. We had no idea what his real name was, where he actually came from, or what he was running from. Sometimes I wonder if we were just convenient cover for him, or if he had some other plan that we never found out about.